Hey guys, this is Mark Howard, author of the Griffin Legends fantasy novel series. Thanks for joining me here tonight, or morning, or whatever it is, whatever time it is, where you are right now as you're watching. So, I have, there's a lot of things going on right now with me. I have an upcoming doctor's appointment. I've got a little bit of a medical procedures. I'm going to have my eyes worked on here a little bit. So I'm not sure what the recovery time for that will be exactly. So I may or may not be able to get another video into you guys next week here. So I was thinking about that more than some other things here as of late, and so I was trying to think what would be a good treat for you guys here, and I have been meaning to read you guys my short story, Son of House Loridan. I've been meaning to read this for a while, but I've hesitated a little bit just because even a short story can be a little bit longer to read, and so I didn't know if that was something we wanted to spend quite a lot of time doing, but I've got no better ideas for tonight here, and so I hope you guys enjoy this short story. I know I really enjoyed writing it. I'm not the best narrator out there. I may stumble over my words here a little bit, and time is still of such a rarity for me that it kind of has to be done in one take here. So apologies in advance if I stumble over my words a bit. I'm in a room where the light will turn off after a few minutes if I sit still for too long here. So I kind of gotta be on my feet moving around just so that it doesn't turn off as I'm trying to read to you. But anyway, without further ado, I hope you guys are excited for this story. So sit back, relax, do whatever it is you typically do when you are listening to an audiobook or something like that. And hopefully this is not the most painful thing in the world for any of us involved. All right. Son of House Loridan. The knight's eyes opened as his body slowly gyrated in the saddle, his horse's hooves gently thumping the ground below. Somehow, he had not fallen out of the saddle after he had lost consciousness. Looking about, he breathed a sigh of relief as he recognized the familiar grassy green contours of the fields he passed on the road back home. Good boy. The knight patted his steed's gray neck as he winced at the sudden sharp pain from his shoulder and side. The wounds he had received in battle a few hours before throbbed in pain. Dried blood covered his chainmail hauberk and stained his golden yellow tabard. His blood. He reached for the arrow shaft protruding from the wound to his shoulder. Caught in the chainmail links of his hauberk, the arrow had not penetrated very far past his skin. Grunting, he pulled it out with a painful jerk. The knight discarded the arrow, which disappeared in the tall grass on the side of the road. Gritting his teeth, he let out a low hiss. Probing the inside of his mouth with his tongue, he grimaced as he felt one of his upper front teeth come to an unusually sharp point. It must have chipped during the fighting. Nothing could be done about that. The fields, hills, and trees were now very familiar. He was not far from home. He must have been out longer than he originally thought. How could he explain all this to his father, to the others? What would his mother say when she heard? Glancing down at the empty scabbard at his belt, he shook his head. His sword was lost, but his shield was still attached to his arm despite one of the two leathery armes having snapped during the fight. It bore his family's coat of arms, a black-winged lion set against a yellow field. This rare beast, the lamassu as it was sometimes called, was a sign of good fortune. The people said the sons of House Loridan were favored by the gods. He did not feel so favored now. "Did anyone else make it?" he asked his horse aloud. Fortune can be so cruel. The steed gave no reply as it continued to amble down the road. Groggily, the knight's mind pieced the day's events back together in his head. He shuddered at the memory of so many arrows. They had come down like rain, but no rain could make men scream, fall, and bleed like those Nordsmen arrow shafts did. The Valgian army never stood a chance. Quickly, his heart rate began to rise. The knight's hot breath was growing too much for him. Desperate for air, he removed his heavy steel great-helm and held it under his mailed arm. With the cool afternoon air washing over his now exposed face, he breathed more easily. His heart slowed to its normal beating. He could forget today's battle and all the horrors that accompanied it. The road began twisting through some low hills, and soon a small stone castle came into view at the top of the largest mound of rock and earth. This castle, Kolarb, was far from the greatest fortress in the Duchy of Oblarv. That honor fell to the mighty burg of Pskov, with its thick walls, high towers, and mighty citadel. Only a single wall encircled the square keep of Kolarb, and only one tower punctuated each corner of the wall. But the banner of House Loridan, fluttering from the top of the keep, told the knight this was not only the capital of the county of Valgo, but also his home. He and all his ancestors had protected the farms and village Kolarb watched over for generations. The sons of House Loridan had never failed in this duty to Kolarb or the Duchy of Oblarv at large, until today. As the knight's path drew him closer to the village, his stomach sank. Curious peasants stopped their work in the fields at the sight of the lone knight riding his tired steed along the path between the thatched roof huts. Before long, a large crowd had gathered around him in the middle of the village. Some commoners spoke to each other in hushed whispers. Others grimaced in silence, as if afraid he was a dark omen. None could tear their eyes from the bruised and battered knight. "It's the Count's son!" someone shouted as she recognized the knight. "It's his youngest son, returned from battle." "Where's the army?" an old farmhand's voice warbled as he asked the question on everyone's minds. "Where are the others?" a young boy tugged on the knight's tabard. I don't know." The knight averted his eyes. "What do you mean you don't know?" A blonde peasant woman balled her fists around the cloth of her apron. "Where is Bjor? Where is my Bjor?" The knight stammered but could say nothing. The battle had been so chaotic. His older brother Eret had been at the head of the column as they marched to Pskov, but a Nordsman arrow knocked him off his horse during the first volley. With his brother gone, command should have fallen to him next, but, in truth, there was no one in command after that. The hail of arrows had been so intense, it was hardly a battle at all. It was a slaughter. "I don't know." The knight shook his head as the villagers repeatedly asked after friends, husbands, fathers, and sons who would never return home. "His sword's gone." A man pointed to the knight's empty scabbard. "You ran away, didn't you? You dropped your sword and you ran away. You ran away and left the others." "No," the knight shook his head. "I didn't run. It was an ambush. We were surrounded." The crowd pressed in around him. Their questions and concerns quickly turned to accusations and scoffing. The knight's heart raced as intensely as it had in the midst of the ambush earlier today. The sounds of the peasants' voices grew indistinct as his mind turned back to the death and chaos on the road to Pskov. Nordsman clan warriors had faced him on nearly every side as their axes and swords cut down his fellow House Lord and knights and footmen. Even now his comrades' unanswered pleas for mercy still rang in his ears as the men were ruthlessly cut down. "How did you escape if you were surrounded?" A man threw a half-eaten apple at the knight's chest. "How did you escape and no one else?" The crowd began spitting and throwing rocks at him. There was no mercy, no forgiveness. The knight's stuttered petitions and excuses meant nothing. His horse whinnied as a rock struck its side. He tensed as more rocks pelted him, and the knight's vision momentarily blurred as one struck his head. The pain was only dulled by the chainmail coif and arming cap covering the sides of his head and neck. It was just like the road to Pskov. They would kill him if he did not act now. Panicking, the knight saw only murder in the eyes of these serfs he had known all his life. With the knight spurring his mount, the horse galloped through the midst of the crowd. He raced through the village center as the peasants continued shouting and throwing whatever they could get a hold of. At least they did not follow far. I guess now we'll see if a coward's mother does not weep, hooted the man who had first thrown the apple at the knight, as the knight made his way up the hill to the castle. At his son's entry into the great hall, the knight's father, Count Maurus, rose from his chair at the high table. He was a thin figure, dressed in a low nobleman's tunic and trousers. He was graying and too frail to ride his horse anymore. The knight's mother, Countess Sine, was a few years younger but still far past her prime. Her silver hair still had some streaks of brown in it, and her azure gown was of fine quality, but it was older than she was willing to admit. The countess stood beside her husband, with her jaw set as the hearth blazed behind the high table. The knight gulped. He had seen Mother adopt this posture every time she braced herself for bad news. Forgetting their preparations for the evening meal, the servants, footmen, and personal retainers in the chamber fell silent at the knight's entry. He limped through the great hall to his parents. The countess and count stood in stunned silence as he slowly made his way to them. "Repair his shield!" Pointing to the knight's broken-in arm as the count recovered from his stupor at last. "Fetch a physician. See to his wounds. Now!" One of the servants removed the knight's damaged shield from his arm and scurried off. Just as he left, a fair maiden with dark brown hair and brown eyes rushed... let me start that over again. One of the servants removed the knight's damaged shield from his arm and scurried off. Just as he left, a fair maiden with dark hair and brown eyes rushed into the great hall, followed by... a younger damsel with darker blonde hair and hazel eyes. The young women gasped at the sight of the bruised and broken knight. "What happened?" the older of the two maidens asked with wide eyes. "Where is Erit?" "Your betrothed is no more, Lady Alpia de Torone." Hot tears burned down the knight's face. "I'm sorry." Wailing, the younger damsel collapsed on the floor. She cried, begging the gods for the knight's grim news not to be true. Lady Alpia went pale but said nothing as she stood frozen in place. None of this brought Erit through the doors into the chamber. "I'm sorry, Semke." The knight crouched and embraced the damsel. "I'm so sorry." "Our brother?" Semke's red eyes pleaded up at the knight's face. He shook his head. "How?" The count stepped past the high table to confront his son. As the knight planted his feet to face his father, Countess Sine took her daughter's hand and helped her off the floor. Semke wept into her mother's bosom as the countess cradled her daughter's head. Sine and Maurus both stared at their son with hard expressions. Taking a deep breath, the knight looked past his parents as he tried to recall the details. His gaze turned to the blood-spattered tabard, then the great helm that had not left his grip since he first removed it that afternoon. "We were marching to Pskov with the army," he began. "We knew the Norseman clans were close, but we thought Wittimer's forces were still a few days from reaching us. Erit said we should make all haste to beat Warlord Wittimer to Pskov. We didn't properly scout the road ahead. The clans saw us before we saw them." "You're the only one to come back?" the count grimaced. "Some may have broken through to Pskov," the knight clenched his teeth. "Why didn't you?" Raising his voice, Maurus furrowed his brow. Why didn't you join the Crusaders defending Pskov? You're needed for that siege, not here. Gods above! If Pskov falls, what chance do you think Kolarb has without its army? I went the only way I knew the clan warriors weren't. The knight threw out his hands in exasperation. I fainted from the loss of blood. My horse brought me back here. Deafening silence filled the great hall for one tense moment. His parents' expressions remained hard. The few other retainers, footmen, and servants in the great hall turned their faces away from the knight. There was no shame in his words. Why did they not believe him? All I have left is a coward, the Countess sneered as she spoke up for the first time. A Cyclops took my eldest son last year, then my second died in battle today. Now all the gods leave me with is a coward in place of my last son. I'm not a coward, the knight stamped his foot in protest. I'm not. It would be a very fine arrow that could distinguish the brave from the craven. I spilled Nordsman blood today and fought just as well as any. There was no hope of victory and only one path of escape. Huh, that's a tale worthy of bard's songs, the knight's father laughed humorlessly. Fearing for his life, the last son of Count Maurus took to flight. Fuming, the knight stormed past his father and mother. The count's old physician bustled into the chamber and made to examine the knight's shoulder, but he pushed the balding man aside and stomped up the spiral staircase beyond the great hall without a word. How could they say such things? How could he be so despised in his own house? Huffing, the knight yanked on the door to his bedchamber and slammed it shut behind him. He yelled at the top of his lungs, releasing all the fury he had built up in him since the start of the day. He threw his helmet onto his bed with all the force he could muster. Clenching his fists, he pounded on the stone wall until he was too exhausted to continue. "Erit!" he sobbed, still weakly pounding on the stone wall. "Erit, it should have been me. They wouldn't have questioned your bravery if you had returned alone. They would have called you a hero for fighting your way out of impossible odds. You were always the hero." Finally, he collapsed into a chair next to his bed. He breathed heavily while looking out of his chamber window. It was dark outside. Only the faint glow of a dying fire in the hearth lit his chamber. For a few moments the knight brooded. What was left for him? His brother was dead, along with anyone he could have called a friend among Kolarb's nobles. The villagers hated him. Even his parents hated him for having lived when his brother had died. What did hearth and home mean without love and support from those who lived there? A soft knock came at the door. The knight gawked at it, utterly perplexed. Who could possibly want to see him after all this? With a creak of the brass door hinges opening, Lady Alpia entered the bedchamber carrying a plate of hot food. The aroma of cooked ham and freshly baked bread filled the room. The knight's stomach gurgled in anticipation. "You haven't eaten since this morning." Lady Alpia took the chair next to the knight as she set the meal on the table against the wall. "You're still in your armor. Take off your gauntlets. Eat." Lady Alpia sat in the chair and smoothed out the creases in her royal red gown. She watched him with an expectant look on her face. The knight stared at the food on the table in front of him, but did not touch it despite his wrathful stomach. Holding his breath for a long moment, he looked up at the ceiling instead. How could he eat now? "Your parents are wrong." Alpia put her hand on the knight's arm. "They should not have said those things. You are no coward. You are the sole survivor of a terrible battle. I'm just glad you made it home alive and safe." He frowned at Alpia's hand still touching his arm. She was a beautiful young woman. The knight had to admit he had been jealous of Erid until now. He bit his tongue for entertaining such a dishonorable thought. His sharp, chipped tooth drew blood. "Don't you think we should take time to properly mourn my brother's death first?" He raised an eyebrow at her. Erid was a brave man. Alpia slowly nodded in agreement. He was kind, strong, and handsome. He was a paragon of chivalry, and I don't know any troubadour or minstrel who could recite elvish poetry with his passion. But Erid is no more. "You were his betrothed," the knight furrowed his brow in agitation. "I was," she admitted with a tear rolling down her cheek. "I loved him greatly, but all wounds must heal. We can either tend to them or let them fester. What makes you think you or I will have a place in House Loridan after today?" He pushed back his chair from the table and rose to his feet. "House Loridan has honor." Alpia stood and met his gaze. "When your parents' anger and grief pass, they will see that joining their last son to a daughter of House de Torone is as good as joining their second son to this same daughter." "What evil is this?" the knight recoiled. "If my mother grieves for my shameful return as if I am dead, and you refuse to mourn my brother's death at all, then I'll have no part of House Loridan or Torone." Grabbing a fistful of his tabard in either hand, the knight ripped it down the middle. With a large tear running down the center of the tabard, he easily discarded it at his feet. Dressed in just his hauberk and chainmail leggings, the knight growled at Lady Alpia, daring her to speak further of love or consolation. "That's a bad omen." Her gaze briefly met the crumpled and torn winged lion heraldic device in the center of the tabard. "Perhaps I'd best leave before Tuke or some other god strikes you down in your anger." With that, Lady Alpia de Torone turned and ran through the still open doorway, her crimson gown flowing behind her. The knight shook his head. He had to leave, but his stomach could no longer be ignored. The knight quickly tore into the food Lady Alpia left behind. He ate so hastily, he barely tasted the meat or bread, and his bites were so large he almost choked on a bone in the ham. He would not allow himself the pleasure of enjoying another meal at House Loridan's expense, even if fate required him to eat one last time under Kolarb's roof. Setting the plate aside, he now focused on preparations to leave. With a scoff, he took the empty scabbard from the frog on his belt and tossed it on top of his crumpled tabard on the floor. There was no use for that anymore. He doubted he would ever see his lost sword again anyway. His hand briefly brushed over the satchel attached to the other side of his belt. There was not much in there aside from a bag filled with a handful of silver coins. It would have to be enough until he could earn more. Turning to an old oak armoire at the far end of the room, the knight set his jaw. With a few quick strides towards the armoire, he opened it. His hand first found a black cloak, which he draped over his shoulders. Nights were cold up in the Northlands, even in the best of seasons. On the top shelf, he then found a spiked... On the top shelf, he then found his spiked warhammer. After grabbing its foot-long handle and inspecting the heavy metal head, the knight soon discovered a few small rust stains. The warhammer was not his favorite weapon, and his lack of care would have made his father scorn if he saw it now, but he did not intend for his father to ever see it again. He would not be mocked by him ever again. After securing his warhammer to his belt, the knight grabbed his helmet off the bed and placed it on his head over his coif. He took a few determined steps towards the door to exit the room. He stopped. Was he really going to leave forever? He glanced over his shoulder at the crumpled tabard and empty scabbard on the floor. It was too late now. With a deep breath, he made his decision. He walked out into the cold, dark corridor towards the spiral stairs. After making his way down the staircase, the knight turned away from the rear entrance to the great hall and, instead, made his way towards the stable entrance. The castle was filled with shadows and silence. A few low-burning candles stood sentinel in the hallway, but no one was awake to stop him from leaving. He preferred it this way. Let them all find out he was missing. Let them all find him missing at dawn. Then they would regret everything they had said to him. Slowly he cracked open the door to the stables. A few horses slept in the wooden stalls closest to the door, including his sister's beloved mare. However, most of them were empty. The steeds and the knights who rode them now lay dead somewhere between here and Pskov. He walked past the stalls over the straw-covered earth. As he turned into the last stall to awaken his horse, the knight's foot brushed up against an unexpected piece of metal. He stopped in his tracks and picked it up. The black-winged lion on his shield stared back at him. Frowning curiously, the knight turned the shield over. The armies had been repaired, and the servant had left it for him here. He rolled his eyes. He could not bear to take it while the shield still bore the House Loridan coat of arms. Scanning through the stables, he eventually found a small box of woodworking tools. The knight took a broad-bladed chisel from the box. He nodded at the simple tool and lightly began scraping against the shield. The yellow paint came off the shield's surface without much effort, leaving just the black undercoat behind. The knight chuckled to himself. Tuke, goddess of fortune, had a sense of humor if nothing else. Soon, only the black undercoat remained of what was once the proud coat of arms of House Loridan on the knight's shield. The rest of the paint lay scraped on the floor in a small, ignominious heap. So be it. He would be a black knight. No lands, no lords, no kin or duty. Only his steel and steed. The road would be his home if he dared call any place home. The black knight slipped his arm through his shields and armes and went back to his horse's stall at the far end of the stables. Gently stroking his steed's ear, he coaxed it awake. The horse neighed at its master's touch. "I know you're tired," he said, "but we need to leave now." The horse stood and looked at its caparison. The barding also bore House Loridan's heraldry. The black knight shook his head at it. No, he turned the horse's face away from its caparison. "We're just taking your saddle, a lance, and a few bags of silver in my satchel for now. The rest we'll have to get later. It's the mercenary life for us." The horse snorted. "And a bag of feed, I guess." The black knight grabbed his saddlebags and began filling them with provisions. After fitting the bit and bridle around the horse's head, the black knight placed the dark leather saddle on his horse's back. He grabbed his lance from the stall and mounted the steed. All was ready. He spurred his mount out of the stables, and the horse trotted up to the castle gatehouse. An old guard, armed only with a spear and lantern, met his approach. The strongest men and the best fighters had all left for Pskov earlier. "Who goes there?" The old guard held his lamp aloft. "Who do you think?" he scoffed. The guard looked him up and down for a moment. He scowled but nodded in apparent understanding. The expression on his face softened for the slightest moment. "Fortune be with you, Black Knight," the guard prayed. "She wasn't today," he answered. "Perhaps Helios will be kinder to you in the morning than Tuke was today," the old man shrugged. The Black Knight held his tongue. He would not blaspheme any further, even if the gods were cruel today. "Open the gate for the Black Knight's departure," the sentry called out over his shoulder. The gate yawned open with a low creak, and the Black Knight spurred his horse through the portal without another word. He did not look back. He would not. The few muddy streets in the village were empty now. All the peasants lay quietly in their hovels. Perhaps some, if not most of the villagers, silently mourned the deaths of their loved ones with tear-stained pillows on their beds. The village, like most of the others Count Maurus was lord over, had many sons levied into the army fated to die on the road to Pskov. Their sorrow no doubt was great, but the Black Knight felt little pity for them after how they treated him upon his return. Whatever they were doing at this late hour, he was only too glad not to have to see them again. The Black Knight passed through the village quickly and quietly. He turned his horse south on the road leading away from Pskov. Perhaps he would travel through Freudland or Pavik for a while. Maybe he would continue south all the way to Mirborg and leave the kingdom of Asgard altogether. If he earned enough money, he could eventually buy passage on a ship to the Ostlands. He was pretty good at jousting. It would not take him long to earn some prize money. The possibilities were endless. All he knew for certain was he would get as far away from Pskov and Kolarb as he could. Soon the Black Knight found himself surrounded by trees as the road narrowed to a thin dirt path. He gripped his lance tightly as his eyes scanned the darkness. Monsters prowled the forests at night. It would be wise to make camp, light a fire, and travel again in the morning. But the Black Knight's determination to put some distance between himself and his former kin put to flight all thoughts of caution. As midnight approached, his eyelids began to grow heavy. He had been traveling for a while, and he was certain his mount needed to a rest too. They had been through so much. A high-pitched shriek pierced the night air. The Black Knight's heart jumped, and his eyes darted in every direction. Was it an Amarok, a ferocious direwolf said to thirst for men's souls? Another scream. It sounded like a woman's voice. Perhaps it was a witch or a banshee. After a third cry, the Black Knight turned to look over his shoulder. No monster howled in the night. It was his sister. Tugging on the reins, the Black Knight turned his horse back towards Kolarb and spurred the mount into a gallop. The steed raced down the narrow dirt path through the forest. The Black Knight couched his lance, ready for anything. "Semki!" The Black Knight strained his eyes in the dark. "Semki, I'm coming!" Soon, a massive figure came into view, blocking the road ahead. Its feline shape was partly obscured by a pair of large feathery wings springing from its back. Its white fur was stained crimson with blood. The lamassu crouched, ready to strike. Semki stood over her fallen steed with the sword gripped tightly in hand. She was pale and trembling, but held her ground with a determined look on her face. The girl's bravery was admirable, but it would cost her life in an instant if circumstances did not change. Yelling with all the fury he could summon, the Black Knight charged the ferocious creature. The lamassu turned to face the galloping cavalier with a dangerous glare and leapt into the trees out of harm's way. He silently cursed. Any lesser creature would have been skewered by his lance, but the lamassu's reflexes were not to be underestimated. He tugged on the reins, stopping his horse just in front of his sister. His eyes darted in the shadows. Where did it go? Roaring, the lamassu pounced from the trees and knocked the Black Knight off his horse. He fell to the ground with a hard thud. His lance was lost in the darkness, but he blocked the winged lion's razor-sharp claws with his shield. He rolled away from what had almost been another fatal strike from the lamassu's claws. The Black Knight stood and drew his warhammer from his belt. Lamassus were highly territorial. It would not abandon a fight so easily. He set his jaw. Had Tuke sent this beast to destroy him? If fate had decided that he would die tonight, then he would deny her this prize for as long as he could. He swung his warhammer at the winged lion, but barely missed its head. Its reflexes were too fast. With a fierce roar, the creature replied by springing at him. The Black Knight fell to the ground beneath a mass of rippling muscle, too heavy for him to hope to lift now that he was pinned. The beast's raw power was too much. Its claws and teeth would soon rip through his chainmail armor with the same ease he had ripped through his own tabard earlier that evening. If he died, then who would protect Semke? That thought numbed his mind to all else. Silently, the Black Knight pleaded for Tuke to forgive his earlier blasphemy. He cared not so much for his own life now, so much as he wanted to save his sister's. She would die without his help. Her life was all that mattered to him. Before the predatory beast could sink its mighty fanged jaws into its neck, it howled in agony. Semke had driven her blade through the Lamasu's side. The beast recoiled, turning to face the young maiden. The Black Knight stood once again. He brought his hammer down against the Lamasu's hindquarters, shattering the monster's pelvis, just as it was about to launch itself at his sister. With an anguished growl, the creature whipped around and sank its claws into his leg before Semke once again stabbed its flank. Crying out, the Black Knight swung his warhammer against the winged lion's skull, which broke with a distinct cracking sound. Releasing its claws from his leg, the beast whimpered one more time, then went silent forever. The Black Knight breathed a sigh of relief as he limped back a step. Wincing, he shook his head. Placing his warhammer back on its belt, he decided maybe it was not such a bad weapon after all. Breaking a Lamasu's skull was no easy feat. He was so tired, but Tuke had answered his prayer. Semke was safe. She was still pale and trembling, but she was safe. Gently, the Black Knight helped his sister's quivering hand replace her sword in its scabbard. She looked into his eyes through the vision slits of his great helm. Her hazel eyes were so much like his. "Brother," Semke reached to remove the Black Knight's helmet. "Come back home with me. Please?" "No." He stood back, keeping out of arm's reach. "I'm not your brother anymore. I'm the Black Knight. Understand?" "I already lost one brother today," Semke pleaded. "I can't lose you too." The Black Knight said nothing, but grabbed the reins of his horse. This was a good horse. The steed was the only man or beast that had been faithful to him all this time. "Is it because of mother and father?" Semke raised her voice. "Please, help me understand why you won't come home." The Black Knight gritted his teeth at the mention of mother and father, but his heart melted at the sight of his sister's tear-streaked face. "I can't come home," he frowned. The dismay on Semke's face grew. He sighed. Mother and father would forgive him eventually. Perhaps he should forgive them as Tuke had forgiven him. "Not yet," he corrected. "But one day I will." "When?" Semke asked. "I don't know," the Black Knight confessed. "But soon. I won't go far." He looked at the bloody mess of his sister's dead steed. The Lamasu had savagely mauled it. She had loved her mare as much as any young woman could, and she had taken it out in search of her brother, knowing the risks. It was another tragic loss for House Loridan this day. "You need to go home now." The Black Knight handed the reins of his horse to his sister. "You will be missed." "Wait," Semke held up her hand. She rushed to her own fallen steed and opened up one of the saddlebags. From it, she produced a black linen cloth. Unfolding it, she revealed it to be a plain black surcoat. "I found you ripped your tabard in your room and thought you would need something to keep you warm," she explained. "I brought it in case I couldn't convince you to come back with me. You can be stubborn sometimes." Without offering any thanks, the Black Knight took the surcoat and traded it for his steed's reins. He briefly removed his great helm and slid the surcoat over his hauberk. He put his helmet back on and started limping back down the road south again. "Goodbye, brother," Simke called out as she climbed into the horse's stirrups. "I told you, I'm the Black Knight now," he reproved her with a glance over his shoulder. "You may be a Black Knight, but you're still my brother," she insisted. "And you're still a son of House Loridan. I'll make sure mother and father remember that." The Black Knight waved to her briefly as he continued down the path through the forest. Simke watched him from atop his steed for a while, but he soon lost sight of her in the dark trees. She would soon go home back to Kolarb, he was sure. Despite his wound, the Black Knight walked down the road until at last the sun rose. The wound only bled a little, and not for long. He would stop and clean it He would stop soon to clean it. He would stop to clean it soon before an infection could set in. Curious how Simke had gotten a black surcoat, he took it off and closely examined the garment. Its interior was the same golden yellow as House Loridan's coat of arms. Turning it inside out, the knight smiled ruefully as he discovered the heraldic black lamassu emblazoned on the middle of the surcoat. He reversed the garment again, changing it to what was really inside out before putting it back on. His thoughts turned to his lost lance that he forgot to recover after fighting the winged lion. It did not matter now that he was deprived of his horse. Such a long, heavy spear was better suited to fighting while mounted anyway. He could not go far from Oblarv without a steed. He might have to serve as a mercenary in Pavik or Friadlad before he could afford a new warhorse. Then, he would probably need to win some jousts in a tournament circuit before he could afford passage on a ship to the Ostlands. By that point, he might as well return to Kolarb. He was still a son of House Loridan after all. All right, well, thank you guys so much for watching and listening to all that. I know I stumbled a couple times there. Like I said, it's I'm not the greatest narrator, and I only have time to do one take really. But at any rate, I hope you really enjoyed that, and we will see you next time. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Take care.